I'm Jeevan Vasiga. I'm climate editor at Tortoise Media. This is one of a series of events that we're doing that are co-curated with the One campaign. The other two events will be digital sessions that will happen later this month. Today we're talking about climate resilience and about adaptation and about what we can learn from the Global South on the subject of climate resilience. We're here about partway through the first week of COP. So we're here to think about what we've learned so far from the climate change conference and what we can draw from it about how to change the system. I'd like to start by saying, firstly, a big thank you to the One campaign for being our partners on this. And secondly, thank you to the New York Times who are hosting us in their space at Sharm. I'm joined by Adenika Oladosu, Louisa Neubauer, who are both climate activists, and Raymond Onovigan, who's the CEO and founder of Romco, which is a recycling business. We're also going to be joined online in a few moments by Dr. Salim Hook, who's director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. And I think he's joining us from Sharm, where he is at the moment. Adenika, if I could start by asking you for your impressions really so far of the first few days at COP. We know how high the stakes are. We know how high the stakes are every year. What's your assessment of the progress that has been made, of what you've seen so far from the last few days?
Okay, very well. COP27 has been like every other COP, whereby we see more promises. But yeah, the most important part of it is how to make these promises a reality. Because I wrote for The Independent that came out this week, talking about the fact that if we have made every other promises a reality from previous COP, I think dealing with the reality of the climate change crisis would have been a gone thing. We'll not be here protesting every year and there for climate justice. But here we are again. We are still making more promises. And what baffles me most was when John Kerry talked about carbon credits. It's really an off thing to talk about, because community like mine has been faced with the climate change crisis, talking about the flood that happened in Nigeria, that out of 36 states, 33 are affected by the climate change crisis. So you mean like carbon credit is like giving those big polluters access to keep depleting or destroying our communities, the Niger Delta crisis in Nigeria that is affecting the livelihoods, their inability to access their soil to plant anything, and the rest. And so far, it's not been different from every other COP. And I think what leaders can do more to see that they are able to turn up, because at COP26 we saw other leaders coming out, but these many leaders didn't even show up. It really tells poorly at this COP27, looking at the fact that it's happening in the landscape whereby Africa bears the lowest carbon footprint. I think most leaders from the global north would have showed up for solidarity to make promises. Maybe they are afraid of making promises that they can't fulfill.
Adenika, you've summarized that beautifully. I mean, as you say, what we've seen in the last few days at COP is a significant lack of action. And one of the consequences of this inaction, and this inaction that's really been going on for years, you talked about business as usual, that's what we've had for years. So one of the consequences of this is a rising demand for climate justice. We've seen a rising demand for, I think the term climate reparations has even been used, and you've addressed that point as well in some ways, talking about the climate impacts that developing countries have been facing. What form is this demand taking at this year's climate change conference, that demand for compensation or for reparations?
Okay, very well. We have seen that loss and damage have taken the center role for this COP27, which I feel it should be, because the climate change crisis is leading to loss and damage, and to a certain extent, if there is...
Adenika, just to explain the term loss and damage for people who... I know the people in the room will know what it means, but maybe not everyone.
Loss and damage could be from the loss of life, culture, identity, land, even the loss of everything that feels significant to us, even our natural and cultural heritages, So this loss and damage, there are some that is even beyond finance. Just for example, losing your cultural heritage, it can neither be replaced nor restored. So it becomes permanently displaced or lost. And so that's that is morally not right, because you could imagine me losing my natural heritage. How do I tell the stories to the next generation coming? It takes away the stories, it takes away everything that belongs to us that we could use to trace our history. And that is the danger there, in that the climate change crisis is breeding loss and damage that are even beyond repair or could never be replaced. And how do we make this a reality when we have climate finance at the center of it all?
Yeah.
If those financial commitments has been met, we'll not get to the point of losing those assets that we cared for. And that is why it's important for us to act now, that there's a danger of inaction than for us to act now, that what we don't want to do, we might at last do it at a very high cost, that might mean us losing several important things for us. Looking at the floods, the flood that happened in Nigeria cost billions of dollars,
Right.
even more than the hurricane that happened in Florida.
Adenika, absolutely right to say that we're already in the era of climate change, already in the era of suffering losses from climate change. We're going to go deeper into this topic a bit later in this conversation. And I should say to the audience, we'd love to hear from you. We welcome your participation. So please raise your hands. My colleague Barney at the front here has a mic. So please come in with your contributions too. And the same to everyone watching us online. I'd like to just come to one thing which you mentioned to me just before we came on, which is that you have a very specific ask of the global north, really. And I know that you want to sort of mention that at some point in this conversation. Perhaps this might be the right moment.
Okay, very well. And because of all of this, I'm partnering with One to launch a petition for my call for climate justice to world leaders, especially those from the global north, to see that they take the real actions that are needed, that enough of the talk, now we need to act. We need real-time actions. How about the promises that have been made from previous COP? By world leaders, how are they making this a reality in their various home countries? And that is why I'm launching this petition. It's now available. You could sign to show solidarity to it, because we need climate action as soon as possible. We cannot keep delaying, because a lot of damages are happening every minute, every second. Different countries, different countries around the world are feeling the impact of the climate change crisis, be it cyclone, flood, drought, and sometimes multiple crises, because the climate change crisis is not a single event, it's a multiple event. Like Nigeria, we are dealing with flood, with droughts, the conflict between the farmers and the herdsmen. And I think the global north leaders need to do well to see that they make all their commitments or promises to be fulfilled. Imagine the $100 billion annual commitment. Recently I was told that a side event.
Just to jump in and explain, this $100 billion was promised by leaders of the global north to help with adaptation, and it has not been delivered. Right?
Yeah, I think this was a promise that was made by the global north leaders to make vulnerable countries like mine to build resilience against the climate change crisis. But we are still seeing that they are falling short of this commitment. And it's a whole big issue, because right now, even the $100 billion can't even take care of the current crisis. Because I saw a figure that is shocking, looking at the fact that we might keep losing or having damages that's worth trillions of naira. So it's a big challenges to see that. And now at COP, we are saying more financial commitments. But how that becomes a reality, that is what we need. That is what matters the most.
Adenika, thank you very much. Brilliant opening, really drawing together a number of the strands here. So firstly, we're already living in an era of climate change. We're already suffering from irreversible losses. We're already suffering the consequences of inaction. So what I want to talk about really for the rest of this session is to think about how we can bring about some changes in the system, what we can do as individuals, what we can do as a society, what we expect from our politicians, political parties, what role business can play. Bring in Raymond on that. Louisa, to come to you. So Louisa, you were Fridays for Future activist, climate activist in Germany. Your name is on a legal challenge, a successful legal challenge to the German government over its climate change legislation. If you could just begin by reminding us about that and telling us what happened then, and I'd like to ask you a bit more about that. Yeah.
Yes, of course I can do that. Thank you so much for having me here. Yes, so in 2019 we started protesting in Germany against our governmental climate inaction every single week. And we grew to become more people on the streets every single week for an entire year. ending up with 1.5 million people on the streets on a single day in Germany in September 2019, joined by millions of others from across the globe. And we thought the message was quite clear. We have a climate crisis, we have solutions to it, and we need governments to bring both together, and we have the so-called majorities in the society. So there wasn't a single excuse left. We had businesses out at our side, and the churches, and the kindergartens, and the hospitals, and the nurses, and everyone was really there. And after that day, after we had been making the climate crisis the decisive issues for election after election, after we've brought 30,000 scientists to declare that we were right, and after we'd asked scientific institutions to provide studies to really pin down how we can stick to our global climate promises, after all of that, the government decided to introduce a carbon tax worth 10 euros per ton. We know that a single ton of CO2 creates damages that go in the hundreds, and they decided to go by 10, which was obviously a joke to everything we had been fighting for.
Right.
And so after all of that, we decided, okay, we need to go a step further, and we went to court to sue our government in front of the Constitutional Court in Germany. And we didn't do this lightheartedly, and that's why I explained what we did before. Because before we did that, living in a very rich democracy in the global north, we did every single other thing we could possibly think of.
Yeah.
Before we went to court. Because growing up in a democracy, it was never my dream as a democratic person to sue my own government. It is something that frustrates me, that saddens me, and that's something that no child should ever do anywhere on the planet, I feel. But we took our government to court, and together with a group of young people from Germany, but also from other countries around the world, joined by several NGOs, by several lawyers, we won. Okay. Against every expectation of ours. We won this case, having our constitutional court to declare that our governmental inaction, that our insufficient climate plans are threatening our young people's rights to a safe future, to a freedom in the future, and that they eventually violate our right to have the same chances and perspective than our parents have today. And that is something that has never happened before on the planet, such a decision, which we won then.
And that decision has produced a lot of elation, yeah. Louisa. So a lot of people around the world, as Adanika says, have seen these years of political inaction, have seen years of business as usual from oil and gas companies continuing to extract supplies of fossil fuels that we know that we can't burn. So there's a feeling now that perhaps the courts are a channel for achieving, if I can use the words, climate justice, or a way at least of holding governments to account. How optimistic are you that this judicial channel can succeed when others have been stalemated?
Well, I think courts will play, and are already playing, a hugely important role in our fight for climate justice. Litigation, climate litigation, I mean, there are thousands of court cases opened across the globe at this moment. These can be a hugely valuable tool, and I speak about tools because I think we need to consider our fight or our struggle as something where we need toolboxes. So this is one tool. Yet I think there is also a tendency to romanticize what climate litigation can do and what it cannot do. Because we face a court system, a law system that was created in times when the climate crisis didn't matter, and it was created by those who tended to benefit from the climate crisis or even cause the climate crisis. So of course, when we talk about system change, we need to also think about what is right and what is wrong in the climate crisis. In the 21st century, what is illegal and what is legal, what is right and what is wrong, has fundamentally changed, and who needs to be protected from whom has also been fundamentally turned upside down. And as we see in the US, for instance, with the case around the Environmental Protection Agency, where a court case has eventually caused more climate damage, we also see that this is a very, very fluid tool. So courts can just as well be used.
Louisa, just to jump in and explain that point about the Supreme Court. So this is a case. So the point you're making, a very good one, is to say that the courts can be a tool for climate activists, but that they can also be a tool to hold up climate action. So you're referring to a Supreme Court ruling from earlier this year that effectively limited what the US Environmental Protection Agency could do on climate. So So we can see this moving in both directions potentially.
The courts aren't just accessible to climate activists, right? And for a long time, courts were most accessible to those who are fueling the climate crisis. We see, not going into details here, but people possibly know about the Chevron case in the US, where the lawyer behind a very, very important case against Chevron and their environment damages was sentenced to ridiculous amounts of days in arrest and to the which ended up him having to stay in
So this is a case involving Chevron in Ecuador, I believe,
yes, exactly.
where the lawyer for the Ecuadorian community groups found himself in prison.
Yes, absolutely.
So climate activists and climate-friendly lawyers can face severe consequences, I guess, is the
and that's why we need to look at. And it's absurd that in the 21st century, when all the science is so clear, when the community speaks such a clear language about what is going on, the climate reality, we see that those who defend the planet, our livelihoods and our rights and our justice tend to be criminalized, while those who are fueling all of that, causing all of that, profiting all of that, usually enjoy huge amounts of status, power, influence, and wealth. And that is also something that's reflected in our court system that we are fighting to turn upside down. So every single case, of course, we need to understand as part of a bigger question about what kind of systems changes do we need at courts and in every other place, really, to create an environment where we have a slight chance to win the fights for the present and the future.
Thank you very much, Louisa. So you've raised a really important point, which is that this is about broader systems change. I want to come back into that in a moment. But first, to you, Raymond Onowigan of Romco. Part of systems change, I think, is the role that companies play, that businesses play in the transition. We all know that we're in the middle of a transformation, really, of our economy, of our society. There's a part for everybody to play in that. Can I ask you, firstly, just to tell us a little bit about your business. So you're a recycling business that was launched, but you're from, tell us about yourself. You're from London, but you've launched a business in Africa, right?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sergey. I'm from London, South London to be precise, and I decided in 2014...
Your accent helps us track you down to the postcode.
I was going to say.
I know. Can't take South out of the Londoner, as I take it. Yeah, so for us it was a case of coming over to Africa to have an impact, right? So immediately coming over to the continent, you can just see the amount of waste that was lying around.
Yeah, and sorry, what kind of waste are we talking about here?
All types. To put that into context, I mean, only 13% of recyclable actual materials is actually recycled in Nigeria itself, right?
Yeah.
You've got rates of 4% of MSW actually being targeted, whereas you've got countries like Germany where rates are closer to like 65 going on towards 70%. So there's a massive, you can just literally see it. I mean, since 2014, we've seen significant improvements. But yeah, there's still a long way to go, right?
Yeah, and just to explain for the audience, so your business is involved in recycling non-ferrous metals.
Non-ferrous
what kind of
metals. Non-ferrous base metals that are sort of critical towards this, everything that we're discussing today, towards electrification, towards this energy transition,
so immensely valuable commodities, really. Yeah. And obviously kind of producing those from virgin materials is very environmentally damaging, creating a lot of emissions. So it's an important part of having a circular economy to have a business like yours involved in recycling these products. But just tell us, so your company's launched in Nigeria, that's right? So, tell us about some of the challenges you faced with that.
Yeah, so we're headquartered in London. We actually started off in Nigeria first, but now obviously our structure sits in London as the main company. And we operate now in both Nigeria and Ghana. Mm-hmm. And we also operate in sub-countries such as Burkina Faso and Togo as well. So effectively what we do, as you mentioned there, we stop or we help to alleviate, if you will, the pressures of virgin ore mining by using recycled materials, putting them back into society and really repurposing these materials.
So as you pointed out, you're not operating in a rich country where there is a local government with high levels of capability sort of helping to sort the waste, and people are being instructed to sort their waste. So what are the difficulties of operating as a company like yours? How do you come in and sort of streamline this process, and what are the challenges you face?
Well, I suppose there's a lot of challenges, right? But I suppose these challenges present opportunities as well. So I suppose, just kind of list it. I mean, we can be here for ages if I start talking about all the challenges, but
Yeah, if you can pick out perhaps the biggest one for you. Yeah.
Biggest one obviously would be access to capital.
Right.
I mean, we've been quite lucky now because of the scale that we've reached to. And, you know, our focus on transparency and traceability has allowed us to actually bring on more sort of institutional capital at this stage now. But initially, obviously, you know, being, you know, I suppose, say, especially in emerging markets, you know, everybody's kind of geared towards oil and gas, as we know. Especially in 2014, we're now starting to see that narrative shift where people are looking for sort of non-oil exports and different types of commodities that we can export out of Africa, but also with value add on those products as well. But definitely access to capital is a massive challenge. I mean, being from London, but being Nigerian as well, I suppose, also has its difficulties to some extent when, you know, you're trying to pitch this idea to several investors, and you know, some people just don't take easy to it initially.
Right.
But when we've managed to prove the concept and prove the model in itself and show that, hey, you can be sustainable and you can make profits at the same time, naturally, obviously, that's eased our way in terms of attracting more institutional capital.
Okay, and what about partners? So obviously, companies don't operate in a vacuum. You need partners to sort of help you with waste collection, you need a supply chain to be part of. Yes. How do you find that?
So we've had to build our own supply chain. So rightly said, as you said, if you're in a sort of developed economy, you'll have sort of, you know, local authorities taking away, handling MSWs, etc., and sort of providing those off to recyclers and sort of, you know, their own.
Could you just explain that abbreviation?
So it's like municipal solid waste.
Right.
So it's kind of like sorting facilities, right? So where your household waste would go to the local councils, where they, you know, you'll have an operator who would actually sort through these materials and provide the necessary materials to the relevant recyclers, if you will.
Right, and that isn't happening in the place you're operating.
Doesn't exist over there.
Right.
So we've had to create the infrastructure, put it in place.
And just tell us in brief how you created that. I mean, is that by encouraging
hard work?
Right.
I mean, it's encouraging other entrepreneurs to get involved in the sector.
Okay. So you've basically created your own ecosystem.
Exactly.
Right.
So what we've done is we've created our own supply chain network. We've helped people grow their own businesses and actually realize that you can build waste from wealth.
Yeah.
It's like kind of like waste to wealth, if you will, kind of transition.
Okay.
And people have built really successful businesses.
Okay.
So we're turning a really informal sector to something more formal, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to keep this point in mind as we carry on the conversation, because what I think we're hearing from Raymond and from Louisa is a sense of what role people can play and how they can sort of move the system. Even if you don't feel, because I think that one of the big things about climate change is that this is enormous impact in front of which people feel entirely powerless.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear examples of actual change. Louisa, you look like you want to come in on this.
Well, I sometimes also feel that it is a privilege to feel powerless in the climate crisis, because as coming from Germany, we can at least tell ourselves that the climate crisis isn't directly affecting us. That's rubbish. It's affecting everyone, and the science is clear. It's in every place of the world. But I can decide one day, Monday morning, I can decide today I go without climate crisis. And I can also decide to be powerless today. I can feel like I can decide to go for despair and you know, mourn about the climate crisis and don't do anything about it. Thinking of those who are affected every single day, who, you know, where the climate crisis isn't asking politely Monday morning, may I come in today or not, but where the climate crisis already smashed your front door, you know, deciding to be powerless in this moment, deciding to fall back into despair, that is not an option, because the climate crisis is there and you must function. You must, you know, organize the safety or whatever needs to happen. People need to flee. People need to organize their communities. People need to do everything they can to survive in this. There is no space for despair. So I feel talking about power and powerlessness, about despair and all that we can do in the climate crisis, I think tends to come from a very, very privileged standpoint.
So do you think that's a bit of an excuse for inaction?
Well, yes, and I think it's also a concept to tell ourselves that we as an individual can't make a difference while we are surrounded every single day by structures and by systems that have been created by people who went out to make a difference. You know, it's not working out. All of us have a weekend, or tend to have a weekend ideally. Weekends were fought for by unions, by workers who said we need a weekend. We talk of 40 hours work weeks. We talk of minimum wages. So many of the things that that equip our everyday life were once struggles by people, by individuals who came together, who said we're going to fight for that. So enjoying all of these structures around us, whilst telling us we can't make a difference, that is not only just, it's per se not right, but it's also, it seems so disrespectful to those who fought for us to have a life as we have now in many places around the world.
Yeah.
So I'm like, who are we to now start doing this whole thing about how we can't make a difference? Just look up, open up your eyes. It's everywhere.
I think that's really, really critical historical context, Louisa. Thank you for providing that. I mean, I think if we come back to the case that you brought, it can be the case that someone else would be standing there saying, why are these guys in red robes going to care about climate change? What is the German Constitutional Court going to do for me? They're so far away from my reality. So if we're thinking about how to bring about change, what is the mindset shift that is needed really to think about, how we can all bring about change?
Well, I think there's a terrible part to it and there's a wonderful part to it. So we start with the bad part. So I think, oftentimes people ask, so when did you start your activism, or what brought you to the climate crisis and all these things? And I think, of course, we need to understand there's a climate crisis and, it's bad and it's taking people's lives and livelihoods, it's threatening people every single day. But I think, especially coming from one of the most privileged parts of the world, we need to understand that no one else is going to do this for us. And that's a very, very scary perspective. It is hard to understand that there is no one else doing this for us, that our governments are failing in front of this crisis, that institutions are, collaborating with those who are profiting and fueling this crisis. And I think there is something very, very dreadful about understanding if we're not doing this, no one will. And that is an existential, maybe, insight and understanding that I think especially young people, and studies prove that, put young people into a very into a very bad place these days. But then there's something beautiful around this, where we feel what needs to happen so that children at some point don't have to worry about their future and their present anymore. And that can only happen if we now all worry more today, for children to once worry less. And I think there's so much beauty in imagining this world where I can sit here and not feel like my country is betraying your country, where I feel like I can look you into the face, into the eyes, because I know that I'm doing everything I can to make sure that you and your communities have safety and freedom, just like I do, where I understand the sub-Saharan African continent, Sub-Saharan Africa is responsible for 4% of the emissions globally. Germany alone is responsible for 2% of the emissions. What does it do to our relationships? So I just really, see this as something so freeing to work towards this world where solidarity is something not just we put on T-shirts, but something we live, and
right.
Where we understand that, we have just so much to win and to fight for. We can't even imagine that yet, what this world will look like.
Okay,
and I think that's a beautiful aspect to that I think works well with the terror.
A great call to arms, and I want to hold the thought of how we live it and come back to it in a minute. I'm seeing lots of nodding in the audience, and I'd love to hear from audience members who were nodding during that conversation. So I have my eye on someone who's nodding, who's now studiously avoiding my gaze. But do come in and sort of let us know if you'd like to contribute to the conversation or make a point. And I'd love to. I'm also getting sort of digital nodding in the chat, which is great to see. Adenika, I want to come back to you and ask you about a project you were talking to me about just before we came in, which is in Lake Chad, and that is you can tell us more about it. But essentially, as I understand it, dealing with some of the climate impacts that you're seeing in the Lake Chad region, and thinking about how the communities in that region that depend on the lake can adapt to it. But if you could just tell us a bit more about how you got involved in that, and then about what the project is.
Okay, very well. Lake Chad has been shrinking since 1960s, and
has been shrinking since the 60s.
Yeah.
Right.
So it has shrunk by 90%.
Yeah.
And I'm really thrilled about the ongoing project, about the UNDP, looking at the fact that they were able to restructure a whole community that was affected by conflict. And I think that is a very good example that we could use to also do the same thing for other communities that have been affected by the Lake Chad or by conflict or violence, because the shrinking of the Lake Chad is making it difficult for people to have access to resources and leading to the clashes between farmers and herdsmen, and also making the community member, especially young people, to become vulnerable to join harm group of people.
So just to explain for audience members, some audience members who probably know Lake Chad and others who don't. So this is a really vital source of fresh water for several countries in West Africa, right?
That is connected to Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. And so this lake have displaced more than 10.7 million people. So it shows how powerful it is and how it is key towards sustainability, peace, and security. And one of those things here in COP27, which I also find as a solution for that lake, is the fact of that I'll also be addressing a section that was invited by the COP presidency in this initiative, which will be the first COP where climate security issue will be launched, talking about climate response and sustaining peace, because that is what we all need. Because if there's loss of livelihoods, it's become difficult for people to be sustainable or to adapt or even mitigate against the climate change crisis. And
Adenika, can I just ask you specifically about the community adaptation? So that's something you've been involved in as I understand it, helping people shift to alternative livelihoods when their livelihoods have been affected by the shrinking of the lake. Could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think giving them skillful or something like life skills is going to be more impactful in that sense, because they have lost their livelihood. Some of them, they are farmers, they are herdsmen, they are fishermen, and their livelihood are just being lost by the climate change crisis. And so giving them alternative livelihood or rebuilding their communities is one of those ways they could cope with the climate change crisis through the support of government or other multilateral organization that could also help to come in to see that they help the community members to be stronger in the face of the climate change crisis. And specifically talking about the Great Green Wall Initiative, that is going to also make great impact if that wall is being built, to see that it's also... Could you just
explain what that is, Adenika, for people who may not know?
Okay, the Great Green Wall Initiative, when it was initiated in 2007 to see that how they could restore all afforestation or to build back all those degraded landscape, which could help to build back biodiversity, restore livelihoods or give more livelihoods to the community members. So it go handy with restoring Lake Chad, because the lake has shrunk by 90%, and losing it will become a catastrophe for not just the community but also the entire country at large. Because I schooled in the food basket of the nation, and I see how migration of herdsmen, those cattle rearers, breed conflicts, because it leads to the struggle of resources, resource scarcity, because both the farmers and the herdsmen, they depend on the same resources. They depend on land, they depend on water, and at the same time they are affected by climatic factors, and so it makes them to migrate to the north central in Nigeria. So you could imagine, so initiative like that will be launched on Saturday. I'm trying to see how it's going to also impact different countries, because in Africa, climate change is already a security threat. And that is why it's important at the UN Security Council that we have an African voice, having a permanent seat over there to see that it oversees all security activities happening, and trying to see our reality, bringing it to the forefront of these community members or these sitting members, to see that they are able to address it at the African lens as well.
Absolutely. So as a journalist, I think that essentially all stories are ultimately climate stories. And Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine sort of made this point about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a video message to COP, where he talked about the intersection of climate and the war, and how the war is being fueled by Russian fossil fuels. So I think you've made that point very eloquently just now, Adenika, which is to think about the connections that we have between insecurity, between damage to communities and climate. I thought the point when Louisa was looking at you and saying, we want to be able to look you in the eye, the global north, look the global south in the eye. Obviously, for years, we've had a situation in which the global north has basically been resisting liability, has been resisting any talk of compensation. We've begun to see progress on that at this year's COP. Scotland, Austria, Germany, some other countries talking about providing finance, very small amounts of finance, but certainly there has been movement. What's your response to what you've heard on this?
Okay, I think it's a good one. It's a good response, but I think some of these things, I will feel like some of these policies or actions that we are taking, if we don't take it as soon as possible, it will be difficult for it to implement in the next decades because everything keeps unfolding. And I think the main thing there is making those commitments a reality. I usually emphasize making those commitments a reality is what is the main issues therein, because you could imagine Denmark also made their own commitment. The first minister of Scotland also made her own commitment, which was the first person to contribute to the loss and damage fund, which is really brilliant. It's good. But then I think we need to solve it from its issues, because the climate change crisis is caused by the fossil fuel industry and the coal. So phasing it out is what is most important.
Phasing out coal is critical. Yeah.
Because if not, we'll keep dealing with the loss and damage. That those funds that we would have used to settle those loss and damage, if we could also use to also solve the climate change crisis from its root, it's also going to lessen the loss and damage crisis that we are seeing right now. Because rather than phasing out coal, we are now seeing that carbon credit is coming into it, which is really unfair and injustice.
So this is the proposal from John Kerry.
Yeah, I was there when he was making those speeches.
And just to explain, he's talking about selling carbon credits in the global north, basically, in order to fund transition in the global south. But you're saying that's basically, what, business as usual again?
Of course, it's definitely business as usual, because they will always have the money to buy for carbon credits or for offset or wherever, to see that they keep their business ongoing.
Louisa, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, I'd also think that this COP in particular, because there's such an important discourse around loss and damage, and I think global north countries try to shy away from their responsibility by now starting this kind of charity dinner here, throwing around like ridiculously small amounts of money and expecting to be celebrated for that. And we need first steps, and we need the commitments and so on. But just to put this into perspective, Germany is currently being celebrated for providing 170 million euros or dollars, I assume, for some kind of finance. And while of course we need the money to come, the last flood in Germany that has really made the news, with more than 130 people dying, has been paid off by the German government with 30 billion euros for that one single flood alone. And so now people are saying, taking these floods and saying, oh, the climate crisis has arrived, in our places too, so now we can actually start doing this. Whereas I would say, considering Germany has caused 2% of all emissions globally, historically spoken, thinking about what would be 2% of the climate damages we are seeing around the world. So now let's start talking about money. And then we think about, we hear the government saying, well, we can't give more money, and we have to think about all the energy crisis, and it's all so tight. And then we look at what else countries like Germany are paying for. So how is it that Germany is the 7th largest provider of public money for fossil fuels around the world? So the money is there, but currently it's going into fossil fuels in vast amounts of money. So thinking about these, or taking these individual promises of money alone and not putting that into the context of what the climate damage is there, what other money is spent, and how countries like Germany, like the global north, are right now putting into fossil fuels, it's confusing where we at. And I think this is about not just demanding money to come, and money for loss and damage and for climate finance and for adaptation to really put into place, but also looking at where is all the other money coming. And as long as global north countries are financing fossil fuels and new fossil fuel project in the global south, is like helping people to get away from a flood while putting more water onto it, and that is not working out. That is hypocrisy.
Raymond.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to touch base on kind of what Adenike was saying. So for me, I've kind of got a different perspective on this. Again, I'm not so much on the political side of things, just kind of straight to business. But I don't know, I think when we look at it seems more, when we see this whole talk of this COP in terms of, reparations that we're seeing now, I feel it's more like a scream for, seems like aid again, really, as opposed to a help up, seems like a handout, which I think is the reverse. I think it's kind of going backwards. I think what we actually need to do is spend money on actual projects, right? and actually get things going and off the ground. And I think that's the issue you have as well when starting a business. They're trying to raise capital.
There's arguably a need for both, I would say, Raymond.
But then let's be honest on what projects, starting adaptation projects, starting, we have renewable energy partnerships coming on between some countries. That is all great. Yeah. But that needs to include stopping other projects and saying, well, we give some more, we do some nice renewable project here, but then we build 6 new oil plants over there and just hope that people look away. Again, that's lying to the people.
Of course.
Raymond, if I can just ask you from a business perspective, what do you think it is? I mean, obviously your company is involved in doing significant work that is going to help the transition, but what is it that companies ought to be doing, the question they ought to be asking themselves really, because this is something that touches everybody and every business. So what do you think is the sort of fundamental question that someone in your position really ought to be asking themselves about their work?
It's easy for us, right? Because inherently sustainable is our DNA, right?
Right.
Being a recycling company.
Yeah.
But I think it's harder for other companies as well. But I think what they need to do is kind of really rather than just kind of doing this whole greenwashing thing, which we're seeing everywhere now.
Yeah.
There needs to be a systemic change in the mindset of companies and corporates at large, where they actually involve sustainability at the top of their agenda in terms of how can they improve their practices and processes consistently, and how can they actually get to carbon neutrality. But again, this is something that I feel you do need to throw money into these projects, as opposed to just giving cash out to these governments and these countries, because really where this money will end up, we're not quite sure, right? I mean, in most cases on the continent, but I think if you actually use it on particular projects, that would be.
I think the challenge that developing countries are facing on climate is that there are both a need for adaptation and transition, and also quite hard limits to adaptation. Yeah. And once you get beyond that and into successive shocks, you do need relief.
The problem you also have is that to get to this transition that we're going through now, you are going to have to mine. That is the reality. We are going to need these materials from somewhere. And also, again, we're seeing, I think it was Al Gore that mentioned about the dash for gas, that all these countries are now rushing for gas now because of the geopolitical crisis that we're seeing across the West as well. So, look, again, I'll leave it for more of the professionals to debate on how this money is best well spent. But I think, we can't deny that it's going to require a vast amount of money to get this underway, trillions of dollars. I think it works out to a couple $100 billion every year to 2040. And, if we're seeing these small commitments, you said 170 million by the German government, it's very small sums.
Thank you, Raymond. So in the final minutes that we have left, Adenika and Louisa, I just want to come back to both of you and ask you, if we're thinking about systems change and what we can do as individuals, what we can do as communities, you've talked about the mindset shift, you talked about how to think about this. What are the sort of practical actions that we ought to be thinking about doing? And Adenika, if I could ask you first that question, how should people be thinking about this? How should they be engaging with it? Should we be thinking about mobilizing politics, about mobilizing finance, about personal decisions, about community decisions? Maybe it's many of these things, but what would your immediate response to that be, really?
Okay, really, it's all about political will. Because once there's political will, I think everything will just fall in place, and there will be systemic or system change. Because when there's no political will, you just find out that things becomes difficult to push. It becomes difficult to get justice. It becomes difficult to get all our demands to become a reality. And then, looking at the fact that it needs investment and renewable, clean sources of energy, because in Nigeria we have abundance of sunshine, and so it would be imperative that they could enhance all of those opportunities to see that we transit towards a clean energy sources, and also to see that finance towards fossil fuel is channeled towards other sources of energy that could help to build resilience, sustainability, innovations, and every other things that we need to see that we have a good environment safer for the present and the future generations. And it all boils down about the leadership framework, because today we just see leaders making commitment beyond their leadership framework. You could imagine when in 2009, when the $100 billion was mentioned, then Obama was the president, and now he's no longer the president. So you could imagine, but if leaders could keep to their framework, for example, maybe 4 years they use as becoming the president, or maybe 5 years. Those 5 years, what can your leadership give? So rather than making commitment of 2040, 2050s or thereabouts, when you know you will not become the president then, just trying to pass the burden of the climate change crisis to the next generation, or trying to deny climate change indirectly, you could just tell us what can your 5 years or 4 years of leadership give in solving the climate change crisis, because I feel like it's a loop way for leaders to just try to feel better or try to make people feel better by making those commitments of, oh no, don't worry, by 2050 we'll be out, there'll be no coal plant, there'll be nothing. Leadership framework, it changes. Today, it could be a Democratic Party that could be there, a Republican Party, and the whole thing will just shift. Because imagine when Trump was there as the president of the United Nations, he almost left, he even left the Paris Climate Agreement to feel better. So, different leadership framework limits climate action. So what can your leadership give within those specific years of being a president? And there we could start building a system that could help to build resilience.
Thank you, Adenika. Leadership is critical. Louisa, a final
very
word
briefly,
from you.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Two things. One is, people often ask, like, what can we do to start, or how can I start doing something? And I'm so sorry, but everyone is already doing something. You are all doing something by by not engaging in the climate crisis. You're normalizing the status quo. You're normalizing the climate crisis. Everyone is already doing something. And in most cases, if you're not actively deciding to be part of the change, you're part of the problem. That's the reality we are in. There is no neutral zone in the climate crisis. There's no standby where you can comment from the sideline and don't feel affected or don't feel included. You are there, and by not doing something around the climate crisis proactively, you're allowing the fossil fuel business as usual to continue ongoing. That's the first thing. So you're deciding to switch to the good side here. You're deciding to switch to the side which wants to be part of the solution rather than of the problem. And that's a good decision to make, and I would encourage everyone to make that decision. And so that is what we're talking about here. And then, so please do make that decision. And once you decide you want to be part of the solution, it's a bright spot, I can tell from experience. It's a good part to be. Then, of course, it is around understanding that there is no single way we can do this. We have not the one single plan that goes ahead. We have to try from every single way to go forward, and we have to fail. We will fail so many more times, but then we will. But this is not about failing, but this is about trying and trying more and more and more, and not asking for that one solution that will fit all and everyone. We are all unique. We have all something unique to contribute to this. But there's this point, and if you wonder what could be my part B, look at the one person and around you that already does something, and go to talk to that person. They will have great advice, and you will find another person. And finally, in the climate crisis, we have one big problem, as well as in the climate movement, is that we know we are right, morally spoken, and we tend to believe that just being right in this or being on the right side is enough. But in the climate crisis, it's not about being right or having the best solution at hand or knowing the concepts to change things. It's about building the power behind those solutions, building the lobby behind those solutions, making them so powerful that they can beat the status quo. And I think understanding the crisis we're in from a power perspective, where we need to make the best answers, the most just answers, as powerful as we can possibly do, politically, societally, in the media, normatively, is something that can change everything. And eventually we know, in other words, it's possible. We have the solutions, we have the money if we want to. We have the people who are doing something, the people who are advocating for something. That is all possible. Now it's about changing those power into that direction.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Brilliantly put. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. I'm very sorry that Professor Salim Hook couldn't join us this morning, but we've had wonderful contributions from Adenika Oladosu, Louisa Neubauer, and Raymond Onuwigan. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your time. Please join us.